Today we're going to talk about logical fallacies and propaganda techniques. Both of these subjects are introduced in Unit 4 of our textbook. You may recall that Unit 4 is about reading and analyzing arguments. Logical fallacies and propaganda are errors that keep an argument from being sound. Before we start, let's discuss why these concepts are important beyond this class. When you read or watch news or opinion pieces on television, social media, or elsewhere, you'll be bombarded with authors promoting their point of view. They may have political agendas, personal agendas, or even maybe attempting to persuade you to buy something. As you evaluate this type of information, and consider what your own point of view should be, an educated critical thinker will examine the validity and quality of the evidence the author provides when determining if their argument is valid. A critical thinker will also be able to recognize problems with an argument and when the author uses persuasive techniques attempting to manipulate the audience. And that's exactly what logical fallacies and propaganda techniques are. Problems or errors in an argument and techniques that attempt to persuade the audience in a manipulative manner. Let's take a closer look at definitions of these two terms. What is a logical fallacy? A fallacy is an error of reasoning. These are flawed statements or reasons in the argument that often sound true, but they are actually mistakes or problems with the author's argument. Logical fallacies are often used as an attempt to strengthen an argument, but if the reader detects a fallacy, then that can backfire, making an argument unsound. It can even damage the writer's credibility. It's also true that logical fallacies are generally unintended. When forming the argument, the author is unaware their logic is fallacious, either because they've not studied logic or they've not recognized an error in their own thinking. A little bit further on, we're going to identify some errors in logic so that you'll be able to recognize them when you come across them. What is propaganda? Propaganda is a deliberate error in reasoning designed to convince or manipulate the audience. In other words, the author is purposefully misleading the audience for their own gain. That means they may be trying to get people to behave in a certain way that they want, or to buy something that they are selling. Propaganda itself is not inherently bad, as behaving a certain way may benefit you or society, or the product being sold might be a good product. However, propaganda is inherently manipulative. It is purposefully designed to persuade the audience without providing a sound argument. To further clarify the difference between logical fallacy and propaganda, logical fallacy is an error in logic in one specific argument presented by an individual, where propaganda is a technique purposefully used on a larger scale by a group of people, like an institution, a business, or a government. So in order to help you really be able to spot logical fallacy in propaganda when you come across it, we're going to look at some categories or types of logical fallacy in propaganda, and also some specific examples of those types. This will greatly supplement the information that's provided for you in the textbook. Now, you might be starting to see why beyond the textbook you might need to understand these concepts in daily life. Remember, you learned earlier about lateral reading and how it helps you evaluate information you read online. Well, understanding argumentation and logic are important real-life skills as well. As Americans, we often take our freedom to make our own decisions for granted. But that has not always been the case, either historically or in other locations in the world in the past and even today. Well, let's take, for example, back in the Middle Ages, in the medieval times. In the Western world, there were kings and queens and knights and lords and ladies, and it was believed that the average person, like you or me, didn't have the intelligence or the intellectual ability to make big decisions on societal and moral issues for themselves. It was believed that the nobles and the priests should make the decisions for the people because they had superior intellect. And the leaders believed that it was their God-given right and duty to make these big decisions. Well, fortunately, along came the Renaissance, and there was a rebirth of this idea that every individual human being can think and reason and logic for themselves. And when our country separated from England, obviously, you remember we wanted a government that was founded on the idea that the regular person, not a religious leader or a king, would be able to think logically and make decisions for themselves and for society, that all men should have an equal say, and big decisions should be made by everyone. Well, it's taken a while to bring minorities and women to the table, but that idea of government by the people, by everyone, still persists today. It is through argumentation that we present our ideas to each other, that we try to analyze issues and make important decisions as a country, as states, as families, and as individuals. Knowing how to look at issues and make decisions, or even choose not to be involved in the decision-making process, is an amazing privilege we have. Our government has a lot of problems, but we still have the potential to make positive changes in our society and have our voices count. And that's why the ability to logic, to argue, to think critically is so important in our daily lives. Okay, enough of that. Let's take a look at those 15 categories. More categories than 15 have been identified, but we're going to take a look at some of the most common categories. Now, you'll notice as we move through the slides that I haven't separated out which are logical fallacies and which are propaganda. That's because sometimes it's obvious. And also, there's quite a lot of crossover. A type or category can be both logical fallacy or propaganda, depending on the specific situation. It's not important to be able to say which example is which, logical fallacy or propaganda, as it is to just be able, as a critical thinker, to recognize that there's some kind of problem with an argument that might make it invalid or even manipulative. All right, let's begin with the categories. The first type of logical fallacy or propaganda we're going to look at is called the bandwagon approach. The bandwagon approach is when the author gives as a reason that the majority of people are doing something or thinking something or buying something. And so, because other people have done it, it must be right, and you should do it too. Here are a few examples of bandwagon. If a friend says to you, or you think yourself, well, it must be cool because everyone else is doing it. That's a bandwagon approach. Or if you come across an advertisement that say 90% of computer users choose Macs, with the implication that you should buy a Mac too because most people have. That's bandwagon. Now, it might be true. I don't think it is, but it might be an actual fact that 90% of computer users choose Macs. The fallacy is that just because other people or a lot of other people have done something, that it's the correct or right choice. Sometimes the majority of people are wrong. Sometimes this type, this category is called appeal to popularity. The way it got that name bandwagon, little interesting historical sidebar, is way back in the frontier days. This was before there were telephones or television. When people wanted to promote a candidate or a political agenda or an idea, they would go to little towns and they would hire a horse and wagon. And they'd bring a band to climb up on the wagon and play popular music. And that would attract people from all around to come and see what was going on. And then the music would stop and a speaker would present their ideas. And sometimes onlookers got really excited and they wanted to get on board with the ideas. They might even jump up on the bandwagon or follow the bandwagon through town. And so we get this name of bandwagon. Everybody get on board and follow along with the majority. Our second type or category is called slippery slope. Slippery slope is a fallacious argument built on the supposition that a small step will lead to a larger chain of events. In other words, if you take one step down a path, it will end in tragedy and destruction, and there's no way to stop. Think of like being at the top of a ski slope. You start out slow and then you gather speed and you go down to an inevitable end. An example of a slippery slope argument is if you don't stop smoking, then you're going to start shooting heroin. Or if we don't stop using nuclear energy, we're going to destroy the world. And neither of those statements is logical. You can take one step in a direction without leading to inevitable doom. We're going to take a pause here and we will examine the other types of logical fallacies